On the night of May 12, 1956, I drove my Chevrolet Bel Air into a telephone pole on a hairpin turn in Beverly Hills, and Kevin McCarthy, driving ahead of me on the same road, looked back and thought I was dead. He was not wrong to think that. My face was what Elizabeth later described as an accordion-pleated mess. A 4,800-volt transformer had been knocked from the pole by the impact and missed the car by inches. If it had hit, the question of what to do with Montgomery Clift would have resolved itself very efficiently. Kevin ran back up the hill to Elizabeth's house. She came down screaming, fighting off her husband, Michael Wilding, who was trying to hold her back, and climbed through the back of the demolished car. I was conscious, but I told Kevin, in what he described as an unregistered voice, that my 2 front teeth were in my throat. Elizabeth put her fingers in my mouth and pulled them out. That is the sentence. She reached into her friend's throat in the dark and pulled out what was trying to kill him, because that was the kind of person Elizabeth Taylor was, and because I was the kind of person who needed that done. The photographers arrived shortly after, having monitored the police scanner. Elizabeth stood up, covered in my blood, and told them clearly and specifically that she knew every single one of them by name, and that if any of them took a photograph of me in that condition, she would make certain they never worked in Hollywood again. Nobody took a photograph. That was the night. And what came after, the reconstructed face, the paralyzed left side, the 100 bottles in the trailer, the universal lawsuit, the 7 minutes at Nuremberg without pay, all of it follows from that telephone pole and from the woman who came running down the hill. I am neither a young rebel, nor an old rebel, nor a tired rebel, but quite simply an actor who tries to do his job with the maximum of conviction and sincerity. I said that. I meant it as a complete description of what I was, and I stand by it. And I also acknowledge that it understates the situation by a significant margin. I was born Edward Montgomery Clift on October 17, 1920, in Omaha, Nebraska. My twin sister Roberta was born hours before me. I've always found it meaningful that I arrived second, even in the most fundamental race. My mother, Sunny, Ethel Fogg Clift, was a woman of great social ambition and greater emotional intensity, who had decided before we were born that her children would be educated by the world rather than by any one place in it. We traveled: Florida, Switzerland, Germany, Bermuda, France. We did not stay anywhere long enough to belong to it, which is an efficient way to produce a child who is constitutionally unsuited to belonging anywhere. I walked onto a stage for the first time at 12 years old in Sarasota, Florida, in an amateur production. The feeling was immediate and total. I was on Broadway at 14. I was in Hollywood at 26, having spent a decade refusing to go because I was holding out for the right conditions, which is the kind of thing you can afford to do when you are 20 and not yet aware of what holding out eventually costs. Charlie Chaplin called A Place in the Sun the greatest movie ever made about America. I mention this at the start rather than the end because it is the baseline. That was where I was before May 12, 1956. That was the version of Montgomery Clift that existed before the transformer narrowly missed the car. I want you to hold that version clearly in mind, because the version that came after was the same person with the same capabilities, in a face that the industry had decided was the wrong face for the person it had been. The only line that's wrong in Shakespeare is holding a mirror up to nature. You hold a magnifying glass up to nature. That's acting. I said that too. I meant it. I was that kind of actor, the kind who spent a night in a state prison as research for A Place in the Sun, the kind who was drenched in sweat at the end of a difficult scene because, as I told Elizabeth, your body doesn't know you're acting. My body knew a great deal more than was convenient. That was the whole problem in the end. I called Elizabeth Taylor Bessie May. She called me Monty. We had our own language, the way people do when they have created something private inside a public world. We met in 1949 when Paramount arranged for her to attend the Los Angeles premiere of The Heiress as my date to generate publicity. She was 17 years old. I was 28. She was the most beautiful creature on earth, which is accurate as far as it goes, and misses almost everything that mattered about her. What mattered about Elizabeth Taylor was the quality of attention she brought to the people she loved, which was total and not subject to revision based on what those people did or failed to do. She loved you, and she kept loving you. That was the whole of it. She fell in love with me. She said so later in interviews, without embarrassment. She fell in love in the way that 17-year-old girls fall in love, completely, with no protection. Her co-star Shelley Winters on A Place in the Sun, watching us work together, became convinced we were involved. We were not. The reason we were not is something I told Elizabeth in 1950, in private. I was homosexual, or bisexual, depending on the year and the biographer, at a time when Hollywood required its leading men to be neither, under penalty of career destruction. I told her because she had earned the truth, and because I trusted her, and because she was already the person she was going to be for the rest of her life, which was the person who received information about the people she loved and kept it. She received it, she kept it. She became, from that conversation forward, the closest thing I had to a witness, someone who knew the complete version and loved it anyway. You know how it is when you love somebody terribly, but you can't describe why? I told a friend years later. That's how I love Bessie May. On the set of A Place in the Sun, working on a scene that required genuine emotional concentration, I finished the take drenched in sweat. Elizabeth watched this happen and was amazed. That's the worst part about acting, I told her. Your body doesn't know you're acting. She had never heard anyone describe it that way. She never forgot that I had said it. Marlon Brando saw us work together and described what I was doing in the only interview I have seen where he was being honest about his peers, that I managed to convince audiences I was unmitigated male sexuality without making a vulgar display of it. He said this with the specific generosity of one equal recognizing another. I don't think either Marlon or I are imitators, which is why I guess we respect each other, I said when someone told me. Maybe because we both have delusions of grandeur. That was the accurate description of both of us. The delusions were just differently shaped. Marlon was the one who survived. He bought an island and got fat and gave interviews and refused the Oscar and outlived everyone. I did not survive in the same sense, but I was there first, 10 years before Marlon arrived in Hollywood, and the work I was doing before he arrived is the reason the door was open when he got there. He knew this. He said so, in his own way. That counted for something. The party at Elizabeth's house on May 12, 1956, was a dinner for the Raintree County cast. Kevin McCarthy was there. Rock Hudson was there. Michael Wilding, Elizabeth's husband at the time. A pleasant evening by most accounts, the kind of social performance that Hollywood required and that I had always found exhausting. I left around midnight. Kevin left at the same time and was driving ahead of me down the steep, winding road. According to Kevin, I had not been drinking. He said in a 2018 interview that I drove very high before the accident, though other accounts say I fell asleep at the wheel. Whatever the specific cause, on the second hairpin turn, my car gathered speed that Kevin at first assumed was a practical joke. I was known for driving perilously close to other cars. He realized it was not a joke when the car left the road entirely. My car hit a telephone pole and the surrounding hillside. Kevin stopped. He walked back. He described what he saw through the windshield as a bloody pulp, and he thought I was dead. He ran back up the hill. What happened in the next 3 minutes is documented in multiple accounts by people who were there. Elizabeth came down, screaming, fighting past Michael Wilding, who was trying to hold her back. She was not a woman who could be held back from something she had decided to move toward. Rock Hudson was also at the party and arrived at the wreck, and he and Wilding and McCarthy eventually managed to pull me out of the car. But Elizabeth got there first. She climbed into the car through the rear door. The car was, as she described it, demolished. She made her way to the front seat and found me conscious but unable to speak properly. She found me telling Kevin, in what he called an unregistered voice, that my 2 front teeth were in my throat. She put her fingers in my mouth and removed them. Only her quick action, sticking her fingers down his throat and pulling out 2 teeth lodged there, prevented him from choking to death while waiting for an ambulance. That is what the record shows. And then she stood up and faced the photographers and delivered the specific threat that kept every lens pointed away from my face. She told them she knew each of them by name. She told them what would happen to their careers. She was 24 years old and covered in my blood. Nobody took a photograph. This matters more than it might seem. The photographs that would have existed of my face that night, the real damage, the accordion-pleated mess, the face before the reconstruction, those do not exist. She made sure they do not exist. The only people who saw what I actually looked like in those minutes were the people who loved me enough to protect me from the record. Everything after that was the reconstructed version, the version Hollywood would have to decide whether to accept. Elizabeth put her own salary on the line to get me cast in Suddenly Last Summer in 1959. 3 years had passed since the accident. The reconstruction had been extensive. The left side of my face was partially paralyzed. The pharmaceutical management that had begun with the painkillers prescribed after the accident had developed into something considerably more comprehensive. Dimitrick, the director of Raintree County, had gone to my trailer looking for me during filming and found approximately 100 containers of virtually every prescription drug available, and a case full of needles and syringes. He closed the door and went back to the set and kept filming. The industry knew. Industries always know. The question is whether knowing changes the calculus, and the calculus in Hollywood runs on the same variables it always runs on. Can this person deliver, and at what cost? And is the cost worth the delivery? By 1959, the answer to those questions about me was becoming increasingly complicated. Elizabeth went to the producers of Suddenly Last Summer and told them she would use her own salary as financial guarantee for my participation. If I caused delays, if I was unable to work, if the production was compromised by whatever I was at that point, the money would come from her. She put herself between me and the calculation. The director, Joseph Mankiewicz, was not pleased with me during production. He described me to a journalist as still vulnerable, using Elizabeth's own language back at her as a criticism. She noted this and did not forget it. The longer scenes were difficult. I was on medication that helped in some ways and complicated things in others. But I was there, and I was working, and the work was real. And the only reason I was there at all was because Elizabeth had decided I was worth the guarantee. She tried again in 1967 with Reflections in a Golden Eye. She was going to cast me as a repressed homosexual officer, a role that might have been too close to the truth to be comfortable, or might have been exactly the kind of truth the work required. I died in July 1966, before filming began. She did the film with Marlon Brando instead. Brando said later that he felt like he was stepping into sacred territory. He was right. He was stepping into the space Elizabeth had carved out for me, and into a role that would have been mine if I had managed to stay alive long enough to film it. I want to tell you something about what I was like when I was not disintegrating, because the disintegration is not the whole story, and I am tired of it being the whole story. In 1958, I made The Young Lions with Marlon Brando and Dean Martin. Martin was a singer making his first serious dramatic film, and he was terrified, which was something I recognized and felt qualified to address. I ran lines with him every day. When I saw he was nervous on set, I found ways to break the tension. During a party sequence, I hid under a piano and tickled his leg until he had a laughing fit. The scene was ruined. Dimitrick was furious. Dean Martin laughed until he had tears on his face. And when we reset for the next take, he was loose and present and gave one of the finest moments of his dramatic career. I had done the same thing with Frank Sinatra on From Here to Eternity in 1953. Frank was coming from a period of professional collapse, dropped by his label, fired from MGM, the career that had seemed permanent proving to be less durable than anyone had assumed. He was nervous in ways that his public image did not permit him to express, and I spent the production doing everything I could to make him comfortable, to help him access what I knew he had. His performance in that film, which won him the Oscar and revived his career entirely, was genuinely his. I just helped him find the door. Acting is an accumulation of subtleties, I said once. Like shaking the ash from a cigarette when a character is supposed to be completely absorbed in a conversation. The subtleties were what I thought about, not the image, not the marketing, not the career. The ash from the cigarette. With all the accoutrements and mannerisms, I'm trying for the essence of something. That was always the project. The essence, not the surface. Brando said something about me, years later, in a 1990 interview that I find accurate and not entirely fair, and also quite funny. He said, "Monty seemed almost absent of any curiosity about anything, unless it was a cock or a drug or a part he might be up for." I loved Monty, even if I found myself so depressed after any time I spent with him. This is accurate in the specific way that observations made by people who are also disasters are accurate about other disasters. Marlon was the one who bought an island to get away from the sickness. I was the sickness he was getting away from. We were fond of each other. In 1962, Universal Pictures sued me. The film was Freud, directed by John Huston. I had agreed to play Sigmund Freud in what was supposed to be a relatively conventional biographical picture. And what emerged under Huston's direction was a 5-hour psychoanalytic epic that neither of us knew how to make releasable. The production was delayed. I was by that point the kind of actor whose presence required contingency planning, and the contingencies were expensive. Huston and I did not get along. He was the kind of director who found damage interesting and did not particularly want to help manage it. He wanted to capture it on film and then move to the next thing. He had done The Misfits the previous year with Gable and Marilyn, two people who were also destroying themselves in useful ways for the camera, and he had approached that production the same way. He watched, he filmed. He was a great director. He was not a kind man. He was dismissive of me when I was struggling. He made it known to the crew when my behavior was costing time and money. He did not work around the difficulty the way Elizabeth worked around it, the way George Stevens had worked around it on A Place in the Sun, finding ways to get what they needed without requiring me to be something I could no longer be reliably. Huston needed what he needed, and the gap between that and what I could deliver widened throughout production. Universal sued me for production losses. I paid. I did not fight it extensively. I paid what they asked and moved on. Or moved on in the way I moved anywhere during those years, which was slowly and with significant pharmaceutical assistance. The sadness of our existence should not leave us blunted. On the contrary. How to remain thin-skinned, vulnerable, and stay alive? I said that. I was asking myself the question as much as anyone. The answer, it turned out, was that I did not know how to remain thin-skinned and vulnerable and stay alive simultaneously. The thin skin let everything in, and the vulnerability had no container. And the alive part was the variable that eventually gave way. Universal got their money. Freud got released in a truncated version. Huston moved on. I paid. In 1961, I made The Misfits with Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe in the Nevada desert. John Huston directed it. The screenplay was by Arthur Miller, who was simultaneously divorcing Marilyn. Gable was 60 years old, newly married, about to become a father for the first time. Marilyn was 34, and whatever was happening to her that year was happening on screen in ways that the camera captured with uncomfortable fidelity. And I was 40, 5 years after the accident, not the face I had been, doing the work because the work was the only available reason to get out of bed. Marilyn and I recognized each other immediately. Two people with the same essential wound in different locations. Hers was the world's inability to see past the surface of her. Mine was the world's rejection of the surface of me after the accident changed it. We would sit between takes and talk about the work, and what we were really talking about was the specific experience of being someone the world had decided it understood, and discovering that the understanding was a cage. She was not well. I was not well. Gable was by most accounts in reasonable shape for a 60-year-old man doing physical work in desert heat, which is a more demanding situation than it sounds. Houston watched all three of us and filmed what he saw, and did not visibly concern himself with what was underneath it. Gable had a heart attack 2 days after filming ended, and died 10 days later. Marilyn died the following summer. Houston lived to be 81 and made Prizzi's honor in 1985, and received an Academy Award nomination for it. The three of us in the Nevada desert in 1961, the last film for 2 of them, a way station for the third. That is what the accounting showed. I outlived both Gable and Marilyn, and died the year after Houston got his nomination, and the director is always fine. That is not a complaint. It is an observation about the arithmetic of the industry. The people who stand in front of the camera and give it what it needs are the ones who run out. The people behind the camera collect the results. In 1961, I appeared in Judgment at Nuremberg for 7 minutes. 7 minutes. The film starred Spencer Tracy, Burt Lancaster, Maximilian Schell, Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, Richard Widmark. It was one of the most significant American films of the decade, and I had 7 minutes in it, playing Rudolf Peterson, a Polish man who had been forcibly sterilized by the Nazi regime and who testifies about what was done to his body without his consent at the Nuremberg trials. Stanley Kramer told me the budget was tight, and the role was small, and he could not offer me what a performer of my stature was due. I told him I wanted to do it anyway because I wanted to play this man, a man whose body had been violated by an institution that had decided it had the right to make decisions about what he was. I understood this man from the inside. No salary. 7 minutes. The Academy nominated me for Best Supporting Actor, my 4th nomination across a career that had not produced a single win. Billy Wilder said that of the 12 foremost male actors in Hollywood, 9 of them were Montgomery Clift. I was told this, and I thought, Billy Wilder has no idea what he is talking about. And he is also completely right. I lost to George Chakiris for West Side Story. George Chakiris was fine in West Side Story. He had considerably more than 7 minutes. What I did in those 7 minutes, the specific quality of that performance, the brokenness of a man testifying about what was done to him, was, according to several critics and colleagues, the finest work I ever did on screen. No salary. 7 minutes. 4th nomination. No win. There are worse summaries of a career. There are also better ones. Robert Lewis, my acting teacher, described the decade after the accident as the slowest disappearing act in Hollywood history. He meant it as a description of a process, the specific, incremental, pharmaceutical dismantling of a person who had decided, on some level below the level of conscious decision, that the version of himself that had survived the accident was not worth the effort of maintaining. I am not going to contest this description, because it is accurate in most of the ways that matter. What I want to add to it is this. The work continued. Not easily, not cleanly, not without cost to the people around me. 11 films in the decade after May 12, 1956. Some of them not worth discussing. Some of them, The Misfits, Judgment at Nuremberg, Suddenly Last Summer, among the finest work of that period in American cinema. The Longest Suicide in Hollywood History also produced some of the finest acting of that decade. Both things were true simultaneously. I died on July 23, 1966, in my apartment in New York. My housekeeper found me in the morning. The cause of death was occlusive coronary artery disease, which is accurate as a medical description and incomplete as a biographical one. I was 45 years old.
I had 4 Academy Award nominations and 0 wins. I had turned down more work than most actors ever receive, because holding out for the right conditions was the only kind of integrity I had managed to maintain consistently. I had helped Frank Sinatra find the door to his greatest performance. I had hidden under a piano and tickled Dean Martin until he laughed. I had been drenched in real sweat in scenes that required simulated exertion because my body did not know I was acting.
When Elizabeth learned I was gone, she told the press, "He was the most beautiful, the most gentle, the most tortured, the most talented of my generation." She had been saying versions of this in the future tense for 17 years, as a prediction and a hope, and sometimes as a demand. She said it in the past tense when it was finally required, and the past tense was the hardest one she ever used. She had put her fingers in my throat on a dark road in Beverly Hills and pulled out what was trying to kill me. She kept pulling, in different forms, for 10 more years. The telephone pole on the hairpin turn got a 10-year extension because of her. I used those 10 years. The work shows it. That is what I want the accounting to say. Charlie Chaplin called A Place in the Sun the greatest movie ever made about America. In 1951, before the accident, before the pharmaceuticals in the trailer, before Universal's lawyers, before the Nevada desert with Gable and Marilyn, before the 7 minutes without pay. The man in that film, George Eastman, who loves completely and destroys everything he loves in the attempt to become what the world is asking him to be. I understood him because I was him. Not in the murder plot, in the architecture, the concealment, the performance of a self that fits the requirements, the cost of maintaining the gap between what you are and what they need you to be. The face they needed me to be was the one I had before May 12, 1956. What was left after was the same actor in a face that the industry had decided was the wrong face for the person it had been. Elizabeth understood this. She kept trying to give me work in that face. I kept making it harder. We both kept at it for 10 years, and the work that came out of those 10 years is what it is, and some of it is as good as anything I did before. I am neither a young rebel nor an old rebel, nor a tired rebel, but quite simply an actor who tries to do his job with the maximum of conviction and sincerity. I said that at the beginning. I say it again at the end. The job was the only thing I did with the maximum of conviction and sincerity, and when the job was good, the conviction and sincerity were visible in it. And when the job was not good, I went back and found a way to hide under a piano and tickle someone until they laughed. The telephone pole got me. It got me slowly, over 10 years, which was longer than anyone expected. Elizabeth gave me those 10 years. The work earned them. The rest is what Robert Lewis called it. He was not wrong, but he was only looking at the part that was ending. The part that was still working, that part he did not have a name for. I did. I called it acting. Acting is an accumulation of subtleties, like shaking the ash from a cigarette when a character is supposed to be completely absorbed in a conversation. The audience does not know why they believe you. They just believe you. That was what I had. That was what the accident could not take, because it lived inside the work, and the work continued until I did not. Your body doesn't know you're acting. I told Elizabeth that on the set of A Place in the Sun, standing there drenched in sweat. She never forgot it. I never forgot saying it. It was the most accurate description of what the work cost me, and why the cost was worth paying. 7 minutes at Nuremberg, no salary. The body did not know it was acting. The body never knew. That was the whole thing, from the beginning to the end.